I hope you're all okay this evening. Thanks for joining us. So tonight we've got a really interesting sounding talk from Matthew Bellringer called Built-in Innovation, Why Neurodiversity is Good for Everyone. Before we get into that though, just a few branch messages. So the first one, I've gone too far now. The first one, just some requests for how we conduct ourselves this evening. So first is to make sure that your microphone's on mute and your video is off during the presentation. You can add any questions that you've got into the chat channel. I don't think we have a Q&A channel tonight, so if you just pop your questions in the chat and we will get to them later on. So be aware, welcoming and respectful of others in the meeting. Please be understanding of differences, be friendly and patient, and be open to all questions and viewpoints. And finally, be kind and considerate to others. So following that, we do like to kind of find out a little bit about people that are here tonight. So if you wouldn't mind filling in this questionnaire, so you can all either scan the QR code, or there is the link down there at the bottom. Just a little bit of information, demographic information, totally anonymous. It just helps us to understand a little bit more about the people at the event, why you're here, what's important to you, which can feed into the organisation of future events. Right, so we are the Nottingham and Derby branch of the BCS. If you want to find any more information about the branch itself, so our aims, committee members and past events, upcoming events, etc., then you can either scan the QR code on this slide or the link at the bottom. I think Gary will add the links into the chat as well, so you can get them from there. And if you want to follow our LinkedIn group, it's BCS Nottingham and Derby, and we'd love to have you join us. Okay, so I think you've signed up tonight because you're interested in the subject. So if you want to find out even more about it, then the BCS London South branch have an event on the 9th of March, which is either in person or online, called Neurodiversity Understood. So again, scan the QR code if you want to find out a little bit more information about that, or search for BCS London South on the BCS website. And I think finally is our next branch event on the 21st of March. This event is a special extended event to celebrate International Women's Day, which is a couple of weeks before. And we have 8 women signed up to give short talks about their how they've got to where they are, what their passions are, and kind of a variety of talks coming up then, and a variety of different stages of the career as well. So if you want to scan the QR code to find out more about that, and there will be more information around the speakers coming out in the next few days. Okay, so that's it from me. So I will stop sharing my screen and pass over to Matthew.
Hello there. Hi, I will just share my screen, and hopefully you can see the presentation now.
Yep, that's fine.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much, Bev, and thank you to the branch for having me here. I'm really keen, really pleased to be able to speak to you about this afternoon or this evening. So, yeah, and I'd like to start with a historical story. So in 1865, Joseph Lister conducted his first successful operation using antiseptic technique at a hospital in Glasgow. In his own studies, this led to a 2/3 drop in the rates of death after surgery. Though it wasn't until 1877, that's fully 12 years later, that he was invited to a London teaching hospital to share this technique. And this is despite having earned his medical degree at UCL. And even so, him being invited down there and his appointment was still considered hugely controversial at the time. You see, Lister was an outsider. He'd grown up in a Quaker family and developed a strong interest in biological science and medicine from a very early age. He wasn't able to study in conventional places and go to Oxford and Cambridge, which would have been his normal path. And so he developed a different perspective and a different approach. And his discoveries only came about through that approach and because he was willing to stand up and challenge the conventional perspective at the time. It was this being an outsider that really led him to the innovations that he did. Now, Lister's work saved thousands of lives, though quicker adoption could have saved many, many more. And whilst medical practice has improved hugely since the Victorian era, the way that groundbreaking and unconventional ideas are welcomed hasn't improved nearly as much. So Lister's experience has some real lessons for us that are still relevant today. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about built-in innovation, why neurodiversity is good for everyone. I'm going to start by taking us through neurodiversity and its relationship to the IT profession, and how diverse perspectives do generate innovation. Then I'm going to talk about some of the things that can get in the way of this happening and what we can do about them. Ultimately, I want to talk about how the alternative perspectives offered by neurodiversity really allow organisations to develop and adapt in ways they otherwise could not, and that's to the benefit of everyone. There's going to be a chance for questions and for a bit more discussion at the end, but do ask any clarification as I'm going. So I'm Matthew, and I'm a pathfinding innovation guide, and I'm a neurodiversity advocate. I'm also very proud to be chair of the new BCS Neurodiverse IT members group. So I work at the intersection between people and technology. I have an interdisciplinary practice that covers IT, social innovation, and psychology. I'm interested in developing services that meet real and complex needs and in new and innovative ways. I also have ADHD and dyslexia. So you might have a sense of what neurodiversity means, but it's a word that gets spoken a lot and doesn't always have a clear definition. I'm going to explain a little bit more shortly, but perhaps by busting some myths. The first one of these is that neurodiversity is the same as autism. Now, neurodiversity was first coined by sociologist Judy Singer in 1998 in a paper. And it was first popularised by the autistic community, of which Judy Singer is a part. But neurodiversity is about much, much more than autism and affects much more than that. Whilst hugely grateful for the original work that community did, it touches many, many more people. And neither is neurodiversity about mental health, or at least not directly anyway. It's perfectly possible, though perhaps harder, to experience the world differently to other people and be well, just as it's perfectly possible to experience the world similarly to other people and be unwell. Neurodiversity refers to the whole rich range of human experiences and challenges the idea that experiencing things differently is immediately in need of a cure. So if neurodiversity is about everyone, what does that mean for us as individuals? So neurodiversity is a population level thing. An individual can't be neurodiverse. That doesn't make sense. So an individual who is significantly different from most of the others around them, we can say is neurodivergent. So this is probably what we mean. When someone says someone is neurodiverse, the word is probably that they're neurodivergent. And this is, by most estimates, between 15 and 25% of the population when we take into all the different types of neurodiversity around. So each of these different ways of experiencing the world kind of often cluster together. So we can have groups of different neurodivergent people who experience the world similarly to each other, though different to most others around them beyond that. And often these can be associated with specific diagnoses. So you might have autism, ASC, ADHD, dyslexia, Tourette's, or many, many others. My own particular professional focus is on neurodevelopmental conditions, so ASC, ADHD, and dyslexia, and the DIS conditions, dyslexia, dysgraphia, etc. So I want to make it really clear that there are a whole range of others that are valid too. It's just that my examples will probably come predominantly from those. And it's also just as valid to be neurodivergent and not to have a diagnosis, or to not have a specifically diagnosable condition. It's fundamentally about that different, experiencing the world in different ways. You might also come across the phrase neurotypical. So neurotypical is just a contrast to neurodivergent. It's a person who experiences the world in ways similarly to most others around them. Now, neurodivergent conditions are complex. They're socially situated, and they're about people and in their infinite complexity. We're talking about a constellation of different spectra, different traits, and that join up to specific conditions. So each individual experiences the world in their own way, just as everyone else. And you might notice that I've used the word condition to describe these things rather than what you might see elsewhere like disorder. And the reason I use condition is because it's neutral. These things can be both a gift or a curse, depending on the circumstances in which we find ourselves. So I'd like to ask you a question. Do you know what connects these three people? They are Nicholas Negroponte, Bram Cohen, and John Chambers. All of these three people are publicly on record as having a neurodivergent condition. And there are many, many more people from the IT world and from the history of IT who show traits of neurodivergence. I didn't include them because there's no specific, they're not personally on record as saying that they have any neurodivergence. So it shows that really historically IT has been a pretty good place, relative to other professions at least, for neurodivergent people, and neurodivergent people have already made a really big contribution to the development of the profession. You might have noticed that some of the cliches about IT people overlap with the cliches about certain forms of neurodivergence. One other thing you might have noticed is that all of the people in this example are white men. Whilst IT might be a better profession for around neurodiversity than others, that doesn't mean we can be complacent about other forms of diversity as well. And being a member of multiple minority groups can make things harder and harder still. There is one fundamental difference, feature of neurodivergence though, which makes it slightly different from some of the other minority groups. Just looking at the people on the previous page, you might not have known that they were neurodivergent. You might have known their work or them before and not known that they were neurodivergent. The thing is, there's nothing immediately obvious that marks out any of the forms of neurodiversity that people can possess. There are subtle signs, perhaps small tells, but there aren't things that people notice obviously in the same way as are associated with some other minority groups. And that has advantages and disadvantages. Now, one of the features that many neurodivergent people will experience is that they can mask, they can cover up, at least to some degree, what they would naturally be like, and in order to fit in. And many of us are so practiced at this, we do it pretty much automatically, sometimes to the point of which we're not even realizing it, that we're doing it automatically. We'll moderate and adapt our behavior just to fit in with other people around us. For some people, it's so practiced that you might not even notice it's a thing until you find yourself in a situation where you're not doing it. And then suddenly it's a huge surprise. The thing is, based on past experiences, many of us might not feel it's safe to even ever fully express ourselves, to ever be ourselves. And this is a huge loss because the strengths that lead to the kind of innovation that we're interested in are very often the flip side of the weaknesses that we've learned to hide. And this implies that there are lots of people out there who can make an even greater contribution than they already are to their organizations and to their profession. So how can we go about this? As I mentioned in the introduction, working from a different perspective can lead to really groundbreaking innovation. The kind of insight that comes from understanding the problem in a different way, from a different set of assumptions, and coming up with a solution from a different set of capabilities. Neurodivergent people often find that they are sensitive to and aware of things that others are not. Concomitantly, they might also find that they are insensitive to some things that other people are aware of. But that's another story for another day. So over time, experiencing the world differently, being aware of different things, and explaining them in different ways, leads to a fundamentally different perspective. It's not that it's flawed, it's just different and just as coherent as anyone else's. And this perspective allows people to really sense opportunities and threats that others might not be able to see, or not clearly anyway. And that gives us a huge advantage in contributing to what everyone can work with. It's interesting, organizations spend a fortune developing creative thinking capabilities in their people. This idea of thinking outside the box is kind of funny for a lot of neurodivergent people who don't really feel like they have a box in the first place. And this isn't just a one-off thing either. It's not just a single experience. Innovation is this ongoing process. It's about adaptation and continual change. And the combination of diverse experience and diverse perspectives is vital to making sure that that works well. In a recent article, researchers Helen Taylor and her colleagues described the process of combining all of these different experiences as complementary cognition. They argue that by specializing and by working with other specialists, groups of humans find and exploit resources we wouldn't otherwise be able to. This process builds both capacity and capability. It can do more and do it differently. And in doing so, it can bypass the trade-offs that exist with existing strategies. In other words, it can innovate. Complementary cognition also builds resilience. It allows more adaptability to changing circumstances. Indeed, it's such a big advantage that in the paper they suggest it played a major role in the success of humans as a species. And all this is done by developing shared culture, practice, and language, which allows everyone to express, refine, and integrate their complementary views of a situation. Whilst it's not directly mentioned in the paper, neurodivergence and neurodiversity fits extremely well with this approach. So, what kind of things can get in the way of this happening? I love this picture. This saying, next time you're afraid to share ideas, remember someone once said in a meeting, let's make a film with a tornado full of sharks. The thing is, it's not the whole story. What spawned a highly profitable 7-movie franchise was not that that person said it, but that they were listened to, and that they felt safe enough to say it in the first place. If we don't feel safe, we can't speak up and share unconventional ideas. They never even get heard. And if we do share ideas, but they're immediately ignored, misinterpreted, or just otherwise don't get traction, we'll ask ourselves if it's worth the risk next time. Interestingly, I've noticed that myself and some other neurodivergent people can pick up a habit of feeling the need to over-explain to avoid this particular pitfall. And it's important to point out that in many cases, these kind of fears are regrettably well-founded. It's not always safe to be open about what we're thinking, or indeed about our condition itself. Robust research in this space is pretty rare, though the surveys I could find suggested that around 75% of neurodivergent people experience significant bullying and harassment. And this is broadly in line with the anecdotal evidence that I'm aware of as well. So what does this bullying look like? From peers, this is the kind of undermining, rumour spreading, social isolation, sometimes acts of intimidation and aggression that people quite regularly face. But equally, bullying can happen from management. Nitpicking, being passed over and ignored, and generally being discriminated against is pretty common for all minorities, including neurodivergent people. And in a recent study I found, or a recent survey I found, 50% of hiring managers said they would very much be very uncomfortable or deliberately entirely exclude members of different neurominorities from any job that they were hiring for. And ironically, research shows that disclosure can sometimes make this situation worse, not better. Interestingly, in that previous example, as we can mask, there are many neurodivergent people who would be worse off for declaring their neurodivergence if the manager then turns around and says, no, I'm not going to hire you because of that. And beyond the obvious unpleasantness of this situation, it's a concern for everyone. You see, bullying and prejudice are innovation anti-patterns. The silencing of the different perspectives and the invalidation of the breadth of that experience prevents us from using our complementary cognition and from exploring the ideas that we could access through them. It blocks the very processes by which solutions are developed. Bullying is socially normative. It's about holding up people to this imagined ideal that doesn't really exist, but people like to pretend it does. And innovation is kind of the opposite. It's not normative. It's about being different. It's about deviance, though in this case, positive deviance. Deviation is often considered a problem, but it's not always a bad thing. Research shows that in any group, there will be some people just doing things differently and solving problems that other people not. These people are displaying positive deviance. And by seeking and supporting these people and by sharing their innovative approaches through the rest of the organization, everyone can benefit. These people are successfully engaging with and crossing the barriers that they and others face, but there are plenty of barriers that still remain. The difficulty is these barriers are often overlooked by those who don't directly experiencing them, but they do make life harder than it needs to be. And these barriers can add up too, leading to the kind of practical exclusion of many neurodivergent people from various areas of participation. It's that most people can adapt if they have to, but there's a limited capacity to do so. So when all these things combine, it might be possible to do something, but it just isn't worth it. These unnecessary barriers can make us feel like an afterthought and remind us that we don't really fit in, we don't really belong. One of the big ways that we can fix this and address this is by creating spaces where we do. And doing this often has benefits beyond innovation. In a former team I ran, just as a simple example, we achieved 11 hours a day operational cover simply by fitting around people's different needs for their scheduling. We had people that wanted to come in early, people that wanted to come in late. And we had plenty of overlap to do the normal team stuff in the middle of the day. So in the end, we had a happier team and happier service users just by meeting people's needs. You see, tight controls restrict all outcomes, good or bad, and they can prevent people from solving their own problems. So I'd like you to have a look at these three things, and I wonder if you know what they have in common. I'd forgive you for not guessing this one. It's a pretty obscure link. They all came out of flexible, adaptive innovation spaces where people were free to explore without external approval. The two on the edges were out of MIT's famous Building 20, Bose loudspeakers and the research on the cosmic microwave background, particularly the COBE Explorer satellite. And in the centre, the SR-71 Blackbird came out of Lockheed's Skunk Works. These are all spaces where people of different specialisms can meet and interact, where there's a culture of playfulness and experimentation, where it's safe to fail, try things out, and see what happens, where there are the resources to try things for pilot projects, put things together, figure stuff out, and importantly, to demonstrate it to others. When we're taking a different perspective, one that's unconventional, it's really, really important to be able to show everyone how it works, because that's pretty much how they're going to get the idea and hopefully adopt it. For neurodivergent people, adapted ways of working can look quite different to conventional ways of working. They can look messy or awkward, or perhaps like they're not productive. And this can make it quite hard for neurotypical people to participate. And I think it's worth noting here that many neurodivergent people are already trying really, really hard to adapt, and actually are very good at it, mainly through practice. Much of our interactions are done adapted. It always gives me a wry smile when I hear how many neurodivergent conditions, how many neurominorities are associated with the idea of being inflexible. Many of us are being extremely flexible simply to participate, and asking people to meet them halfway often means, why don't you do about 90% of the work, or you'll get the blame for being lazy and not contributing. And this means for leaders and for neurotypical people, this means spending time and effort understanding those with a fundamentally different perspective to your own. It's about trusting experience, trusting the validity of perception as equally valid amongst a range of others. I don't mean taking everything at face value at all, but as worthy of examination. And these examinations mean asking questions, though that's not always straightforward. One of the most common worries I get speaking to managers about neurodiversity is that they don't really understand, and they're afraid of asking offensive questions. I want to give you a very quick guide, just so you can feel a little bit more confident in the questions you might like to ask if this is a concern for you. The first group of questions to avoid are the kind of generalizing questions. These can take different forms. They might be about all people with a specific condition, or they might be tying an individual to a specific condition. At the worst, they boil down to, why are all of you people like that? Or something similar. The other part of generalizing questions is the ones that really you could just Google. Not every neurodivergent person is a psychologist and is necessarily an expert in their own condition. So asking them to explain it all to you is not necessarily something that they can do. The second group of questions are those that are deeply personal. I think it's a really interesting thing is when we're different, somehow it seems okay to ask questions you wouldn't ask of other people. So if you would, say, feel awkward asking a neurotypical colleague about the medication they were taking at the moment, then perhaps it isn't appropriate to ask a neurodivergent colleague either. And the final set of questions are about not transferring the burden of resolving things entirely onto the person who's suffering the difficulty. Questions like, how do we fix this? What do you need? Are valid on one level, but they shift all of the solution onto the person being asked. And the answers might not be obvious. This whole process is one of really getting more curious, but that's a risky process in itself. It means handling your own feelings with what you uncover and maybe facing some uncomfortable truths, facing what your perspective, what your position looks like from outside. One way you can test pretty much all of the questions, if you're concerned about asking them, is really, how would you feel about being asked them yourself? Would you be willing to answer that question? Is it something you can answer easily or reasonably? And equally, when you're looking at the perspective and the approach that's being offered, if it's different, you can look at the conventional approach from the same perspective. Does that stand up to the same scrutiny and the same questions as you're exploring anything new? And the thing is, once you start getting curious about these alternatives, you can start to explore. I have some bad news here, though. There is no recipe, no single best practice for this. Every organization is different. Every neurodivergent person is different, as is everyone else. As the saying goes, when you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Anyone who offers you a simple solution to this is trying to sell you something. The good news, though, is that you don't have to start entirely from scratch. There is well-documented, effective practice for a range of different situations. And furthermore, this is a capability that gets developed over time. It has compounding returns. As an organization and the individuals within it get better and better at doing it, you have both the advantage of the work you've done previously and any more effort you put in. So I urge you to start now in whatever form you possibly can. Doesn't have to be big or spectacular. It's just a step. Prepare the ground and move towards a position where it can happen. And start with where you are and what you have. A lot of organizations and specialisms within the profession attract specific neurominorities. So there's a high chance that there are already groups of people who are doing this kind of innovation work in their own way already. Just please do start, so that those who see things differently don't have to wait as long as Joseph Lister did to see their ideas adopted, and so that those ideas will address the problems that concern everyone. I want to be clear that you're not alone in this, very much not, and it's really important to find support and get the right support. And I'm very pleased to say that BCS is putting a lot of time and energy into diversity in our profession. And as part of that, we have recently launched a new specialist group specifically for neurodivergent IT professionals, which I'm very proud to say I'm chair of. And the goal of this group is to help the industry access the unique talents that neurodivergent IT professionals possess, and support those individuals in our work and raise awareness of the contribution of neurodivergent people and IT to broader society. It's run for and by neurodivergent people, and it's also for those who identify with the conditions and those with a personal or professional interest in neurodiversity. I work in this space. I'm particularly keen to build the capacity to thrive in uncertainty and in the unknown. Innovation, and social innovation in particular, is hugely important to how well we all do collectively. But it's about operating well in this space between what we know for sure and what we have absolutely no idea of. I work with primarily neurodivergent professionals, entrepreneurs, and academics to really connect with and develop and express their unique talents and their unique approaches to big, complex, difficult problems. I also work with organizations and the leadership of organizations to become better places for those people to thrive and to contribute as much as they can. So I offer short one-to-one sessions, talks, facilitations, facilitation, and longer consultancy engagements. this talk is a kind of example of some of the things I can do. And I practice what I teach. This work and the work that I do is influenced by my ADHD and my dyslexia. My ability to make connections, think in different connected ways, and to work very quickly with the early stages of things is a key part of this. That's why I work in innovation. I'm not terribly interested in optimization and the kind of sustaining work. I'm interested in the new and establishing things. So it's about finding a fit for your work, and this is an example of me finding a fit for my own. I'm also setting up a community which is going to be a social enterprise specifically for neurodivergent people, because we're not going to solve all of the problems that we all face without using all of our abilities to do it. I think you've seen some links in the chat. So, and I'm also going to go back and look at questions in a second, but please do connect with me on LinkedIn if you're interested in continuing this conversation. But otherwise, it's time for some questions. So I'd like to ask if anyone has, and I'm going to scroll back through, but I'll ask my colleagues hosting if there's any particular questions that could do with being answered first.
Sure. Thank you very much, Matthew. We have a few questions. First of all, there has been a conversation in chat regarding discrimination against neurodivergent people and whether it's illegal or not in the workplace. What's your point of view?
Neurodivergence is one of the being a member of certain neurominorities anyway puts you in a position of having a disability under UK law, which is protected from discrimination. However, the extent to which this is really operationalized and the fact that there are significant aspects of it that don't really get covered by the legislation mean that there are some fuzzy areas. However, yes, it is absolutely the case that some of the discrimination faced by neurodivergent people is illegal, and there is a statutory requirement to be accessible and to be to welcome people with disabilities.
Great. Annalise asks, will we get access to the titles of the research papers cited?
Yes, sorry about that. I didn't quite have the chance to put all of those together. If we have a moment, I can dig up the links for you. So yes, what I will do is I will stop sharing my screen now because I'm going to have to go digging. Yes, I'll find those right now.
All right. Whilst you're doing that, I'll ask the next question.
Yeah.
This one's from Greg. It's easy to speculate that the vast majority or totality of managers, including HR, are neurotypical in the first place. Has any research been done on this?
Let me. So on the. Research on the extent to which there are neurodivergent or neurotypical people in positions of seniority or in decision-making positions. Is that the question?
Let's see. If I can find Greg. Greg, would you like to elaborate on your question?
I can unmute now. Good, thanks. I can't start the video, so never mind. Yeah, I guess it's always been an assumption that people in management are people, as the saying goes, naturally easy and have facility with dealing with people, and therefore, I suppose, could be said to be neurotypical, at least in interpersonal terms. I suppose they could still have dyslexia, for example, but they might still be very good with people. Whereas somebody somebody with autism of any degree is unlikely to be a manager. That's my sort of thrust, I suppose. Perhaps anybody with severe ADHD, which might still allow them to work very effectively on technical issues, but would possibly bar them from being an effective manager.
Yeah.
Does that explain it at all?
Yeah, there are significant barriers. I would like to pick up. There's particularly with ADHD and ASC, there are certain aspects of the condition that can lead to very highly developed people skills. It's an interesting thing that by somehow, I suspect, by having a challenge to reach out to connect with people, you can actually develop it to a very high capacity. So it's not always the case that people with these conditions may not necessarily come across as people, though they may experience significant discrimination for other reasons, or may be very, very sensitive to their interactions with people. So, though it is true that yes, many minorities are underrepresented in the senior and decision-making levels of organizations, and it does significantly affect the accessibility of those organizations. For me, I would like to see everyone represented at all levels. It's about complete representation. Even speaking as a neurodivergent person of a specific neurominority, I can speak with a high degree of authority about my own experience, reasonable authority about perhaps the experience of other people with ADHD and dyslexia. But it's very hard for me to speak beyond that and to understand beyond that. So it's important that we've got a really broad range of representation around all of these issues. And yes, many of the barriers that prevent people from reaching seniority are really problematic for that reason.
Great. Thank you very much for your question, Greg. Next one's from Annalise. Can you tell us more about your social enterprise project?
Yeah, thank you. So yes, this came out of some work that I was doing. I've often I really wanted a community space that I couldn't find. And so I started to put it together myself. It's really around a self-advocacy community for people who are highly able and unconventional, very much strongly unconventional usually, and probably neurodivergent in some ways, because it can be very, very difficult to get the kind of spaces that I've been talking about, those kind of spaces where you feel welcome, where you feel understood, where you can try things out. Either because you don't have access to them in your own organization, or because you work in a small organization where there just isn't the space, isn't enough people for that, or you work as a freelancer or a solopreneur, as many neurodivergent people do. They very often end up working for themselves because it's easier than trying to fit into an organization that doesn't really work for them. So I wanted to create a space where we could all kind of connect and develop these things together. So yeah, so at the moment I'm working on exactly what form that will take legally, though it's really something I'm very, very keen to see, because for me a lot of this is about really reconnecting with the value that we've lost a little bit, when we've got these unique talents that we haven't entirely been able to explore, and to create a space where we can do that and then try them out and develop them so that we can then get them out there to help everyone else.
Great. Rich writes, as an IT professional with dyslexia, I'm actually finding it hard to progress through BCS. My request for an alternative application process for CITP was met with get a friend to type for you. Is there more we can all do together to make BCS itself more inclusive?
Yeah, I'm very sorry you've had that experience, though. I mean, I think it's it's a real problem for many organisations. I personally would like to see BCS showing some leadership in this, and I hope that the members group can start contributing to this. It is an ongoing issue, and I think for me one of the things is, rather than expecting organisations to be perfect necessarily, it's about having a way that they handle this when it's a problem. Essentially having an exception procedure, a way to deal with these kind of complaints, because this is a genuine complaint. And I think this raises another important point, that there are many people who are excluded from really being able to fully participate simply because of this process. And by improving it and by fixing it, we make it much more accessible to a whole range of people, not just specifically dyslexics. So it's hugely in organizations' interest to do this.
Great. Next question is from Paul. Are there any applications or software that you recommend for dyslexics?
I think this is quite a complex question, because it really depends on exactly what challenges someone's having and what the need is, what they're trying to do. Different people, even within a neurominority, often have different strengths and weaknesses and different difficulties. There's a whole range of different tools to use. The key ones, though, that very often come up are speech to text, text to speech, and I would also very strongly recommend spelling and grammar checkers. I also would recommend doing a bit of Googling and not choosing the very first spelling and grammar checker that necessarily comes up, because it's not always the best one for neurodivergent people. So there's a whole range of tools, but I think those writing tools are very much the useful, the very obvious ones. But really do look to your own needs, and don't necessarily look in the adapted space. Very often the best tools are conventional tools that we can just use and make particular use of. So yeah, I hope that's not too broad a comment. I saw a comment in there that suggested that anyone talking about finding out more about the social enterprise and more of what I offer. Yeah, please do. Anyone who's interested in this, connect on LinkedIn, and we can, and I'll keep you up to date and have more of a conversation about this. Whilst it is my profession, it's also just something I care about deeply, and I'm always happy to, share experiences and connect with people doing similar or facing similar challenges, because it helps everyone.
Okay. Right, there's certainly a lot of conversation going on in the chat window, so we'll need to save a copy of that for your reference later. Participants are very pleased with the presentation that you've given today. I'm just waiting to see if there's any more questions that are going to pop up. We'll give it a moment. We've still got 12 minutes left, so if you've got any burning questions, please drop them in the chat window and see if I missed any questions a bit further back. A bit difficult to tell the difference between conversations, statements, and any questions. Scanning.
Oh, okay. There's one above from Thomas, apparently. Ooh, here we go.
Have you found it?
Yeah. So thank you, Thomas. Yeah. Saying I'm going to paraphrase a bit and try and to frame this. That he's asking how we can help when we are effectively working without masking and we're comfortable with that. How we can prepare others to really be able to engage with that and to engage with that well, particularly in an interview context. Is that a fair summary of what you're asking, Thomas? Thank you. Okay, great. So yeah, I think that there's various ways we can do this, and I think it's actually a really helpful question and a great idea. there are so many kind of cliches and expectations around neurodiversity and specific neurominorities that if you declare one, people will very often make a whole load of assumptions about you that are completely untrue. And that's a problem in all sorts of directions. One of the things that I really like and I came across last year was the concept of an access rider. Now, I don't know if you know, riders are this idea from touring musicians. You know, it's the kind of brandy glass full of M&Ms with all the brown one taken out is the classic joke rider. But they're all of the requirements that a touring musician has to go on stage and perform and do their best. And so an access rider is very much our own example of that for our own work. What do you need from people, from the environment, from the situation to be able to go up there and do your best? What do they need to meet? You know, what are the needs that they need to meet? And making that explicit and giving people a nice clear steer on that is a really, really helpful way of getting these things up front, getting this conversation started. And from my perspective as a neurodivergent person, it's also a really, really good way of filtering out the organizations that are always going to be an uphill struggle, who, frankly, I don't want to work for. So, you know, if someone's incredibly difficult about this up front, yes, it's a problem in general, but actually from a personal perspective, it might not be a fight I want to take on. And it's something I would very much like to know before I'm employed. So it's a really good way of actually surfacing all of this stuff ahead of time.
All right, next question is from HK. HK is finding it difficult to get a diagnosis, finding they are over-explaining, as you mentioned. Do you have any advice?
It can be very, very difficult to get a diagnosis, and regrettably, I think a lot of us who have not been diagnosed until adulthood, and I should add, I had a dyslexia diagnosis as a child, but I only had an ADHD diagnosis relatively recently as an adult, is that we essentially do research, we figure it out, and then we present a whole load of evidence to our GP, who then ticks some boxes and goes, yep, you've got whatever it is, or we think you have, and then refers you. I would suggest whatever conditions you think you might have, to really talk to others who have similar, or who you know have similar, because the range of experiences of neurodivergent conditions can be really very different to, first of all, to the kind of cliches and the stereotypes, and second of all, to what it sounds like when you read the diagnostic criteria of a condition or the medical description of a condition. I think this is one of the fundamental problems, is there very much an outsider perspective on what it is to be neurodivergent, a lot of the criteria. So it's very, very hard to map what that says to how I feel about things and my day-to-day experience. And talking to others who already have diagnoses or identify with the condition can be really helpful in narrowing it down and identifying exactly what it is that might be a useful area to explore.
Great. Thank you for your question, HK. Guillaume asks, what are good or preferred ways for BCS members to nudge BCS towards increased inclusivity?
That's a really interesting question. I don't have an immediate and obvious answer to that. I would suggest there are a number of inclusivity member groups now within BCS. And if the particular form of inclusivity is covered by one of those member groups, I would strongly suggest talking to their committees and raising it with them, because as committee members, we do have slightly privileged access and the ear of BCS a little bit more. So if there are specific challenges, so equally with neurodivergence, if you have specific challenges, then please do contact me and we can make sure that we can at least nudge it in the right direction.
Very good. Thomas asks, will your enterprises help to solve this? And then goes on to explain, connecting those of us, I forgot the term to use, who have these cocktails of conditions.
I think it's very, very, it's more normal amongst neurodivergent people to have a mixture of different co-occurrences. It seems to be that when your brain works differently, a lot of things shift around, and we tend to do a whole load of things differently. So it's actually more, I think it's probably more of us than it isn't. It does make things more difficult. And yes, my intention is that really there's a reasonable amount of information, there's some information at least, on being neurodivergent and in work to a pretty basic level. It's stuff about, you know, how can I turn up for meetings? How can I dress and shower in the morning and present myself in a way that won't scare the neurotypicals? But this isn't actually of much use to those of us who've had quite, you know, who have a successful professional career. You know, there's very little around really this higher performing neurodivergence. And for me, one of the really interesting things that I'm hoping to explore in the social enterprise is what that looks like, and to give some support and some pathways to that. Partly because not only does it make things kind of better for us as individuals if we fall into this category, but it pushes the boundary, it pushes the edge a bit, and makes it easier for those who are more excluded to then participate as well.
Okay. Right, there was one earlier question from Annalise. I asked her to send her details to you directly in the chat window.
That's great. Thank you very much. I do want to just note a comment from Greg. Yeah, open plan offices are fundamentally problematic for pretty much everyone neurotypical or neurodivergent, but they're even worse for neurodivergent people. And there's a lot of research about this. It's one of, it's an interesting area. So if you're feeling that you need something frustrating and some fire, then you might want to read some of the occupational psychology research on open plan offices.
Right, that was a good one to end on, actually. Certainly this chat window has been on fire, and I think it's now time to hand back to Bev. Thank you very much, Matthew.
Thank you everyone for your comments, and thank you to the branch for hosting the talk.
Yes, thank you very much, Matthew. That's really, really interesting, and yes, sparked a lot of questions and a lot of discussion. So obviously, it's very important topic, and you kind of think your neurodiversity group is going to have lots of new members after this. So yes, so thanks everyone. Just a reminder that there is the BCS London South event in a couple of weeks around neurodiversity. If you want to go along to that as well. I think there is actually a link to the information on it from the Neurodiversity group website as well. And next month we have, continuing the kind of diversity and inclusion theme, we have our a celebration of International Women's Day event. So it would be great to see some of you come along to that as well. So yes, thank you everyone for your time, and thank you again, Matthew, for a very interesting talk.